Hello and welcome to Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we will be discussing what makes a good game, and we're not just talking about video games or board games or anything like that, nor are we saying we're the absolute authority. We're just saying here's what works in every format we find at least, and here's what doesn't work and what to avoid. I'll kick it off to Ben for first thoughts.
Sure. Now, this is, of course, a huge topic. There's card games, board games, video games, and there's more theater of the mind games like Dungeons and Dragons. I'd say there are three elements that I would make the primary elements of a great game. First element is engagement. Second element is stakes. And the third element is difficulty. Now, difficulty is the most obvious, so I'll start with my thoughts on that one, and then I'll kick it over to Mara. But it's pretty obvious. The game has to be somewhat hard. For example, chess has a greater following than checkers, because even though checkers is much easier to learn to play, chess is a much more complicated game. It's a little bit harder to learn. You're a little bit more invested. And if you're playing against an expert player, there's just a feeling of this being harder.
Yes, and the other thing about difficulty that you have to remember is that you don't even need to necessarily make something possible to win. There are plenty of video games that have cutscenes where you're supposed to lose. Chernobylite is a great example of that. The opening crawl has a scene where you have to fight an endless horde, and the only way to move forward is to die, not to win. Similarly, there was an old game where if you pirated it, one of the final bosses just became completely indestructible. I sadly forget the name of the game, maybe Ben here remembers, but it was actually more popular to use the pirated version of the game after that because people wanted to see just how long they could hold up against this boss. So you don't even necessarily need to make combat traditionally winnable to make a game fun.
Absolutely, and actually getting back to the chess example, I had the chance years ago to play against an expert chess player. He and I just happened to hang out at the same coffee shop, and he was usually looking for a game. I must have played a few thousand games with the guy. I think I played him to a draw once, and I think I actually did beat him one time. The fun of the game for me wasn't necessarily in winning, although it was an awesome feeling when I finally did beat the guy. The fun of the game, though, was just there was the challenge, there was the difficulty, there was I'm doing something that's hard. Now, doing something that is hard for its own sake is not fun. If that were the case, we would all be doing algebra in our spare time.
I don't think I've ever done algebra when I didn't have to.
At this point in my life, I probably wouldn't do algebra if somebody put a gun to my head. I'd rather just try to take the weapon. That's neither here nor there. The point is, there has to be some engagement. You have to feel like you're a part of the game. Now, Dungeons and Dragons, when it's done right, is an excellent example of this. You've made this character. This character is interacting with the world they're in. Or, getting back to the chess example, you have a grand strategy you're trying to work out against your opponent. But you have to feel like you're in the game in some way.
Oh, yes. In fact, I am of the opinion that character creators are the best way to have an early sense of engagement. Maintaining that engagement is a different conversation entirely. But in most, especially open-world games these days, you'll see at least basic character creators, and more popular open-world games have more in-depth character creators. And part of that is because if you're creating a character completely from scratch, you're going to have an emotional investment in this character, which you would not have playing a Zelda game where you're going to be playing Link, of course. Then, honestly, that's, especially for the Zelda series, that's one of the few major flaws I can complain about, is that the plot repeats itself, so there's no stakes, and on top of that, the fact that we play the same character every time just gets kind of boring and repetitive. So that's the other thing, is replayability is a major part of any good game. While there are great games, the great cannot be the enemy of the good here. There are games like BioShock where you need to play them through to have an understanding of the gaming community, but that isn't a fun game. That is a great game. A good game is something in the Fallout series, where even though they are fundamentally broken games, you have a lot of fun, you're really engaged with it, you're with it all the way through, even though it's kind of stupid, it doesn't have much deeper meaning, and it doesn't really accomplish what it sets out to do.
I've actually never played the Legend of Zelda game, so by all means, feel free to send me the link.
I hate you. Also, have you actually not played the Legend of Zelda games? Just a slight off-topic question.
Not that I recall, honestly. I was around very early on in video. So to give my age away and all that, for my sixth, whatever holiday it was or birthday, I had saved my allowance for a year, and that covered half of the first Nintendo that was out. Like not Super Nintendo, not whatever. It was just the first one. So I had Mario Brothers and stuff like that. I never played the original Legend of Zeldas because the graphics were so bad at that time. And then by the time the newer versions of it were out, I was just into other things, so I just never happened to pick it up. As far as replayability, just kind of an off topic of the three things I had mentioned to start with, but I think it's a very valuable, important thing. If you play, two people can play chess and have literally thousands of different games play out between them. One of my all-time favorite games, Age of Empires 2, when you play Age of Empires, since you have so many choices of civilizations and because there's so many ways for it to play out, so for example, if you're playing one of the more basic ones like Vikings, they don't have a particularly extensive technology tree or complicated bonuses, but you can play on different maps and you can play as, okay, I'm going to play the Vikings and I'm going to upgrade their archers to the highest level they can be to support the infantry, as opposed to I'm going to play the Vikings and they get a bonus to their barracks units attack, so I'm going to attack in the feudal age very early on in the game when my opponent isn't ready. Like there's so many different there's all kinds of variations and options for what can happen, and that creates a level of engagement and, as you say, replayability in the game that isn't quite there with something like, say, tic-tac-toe or even checkers.
Yes, it's in fact part of the reason why Overwatch continues to survive and be very popular. I think it's something like 5 years after release now. Overwatch came out shortly before the Battle Royale trend really took off. It was one of the founders of the genre. So part of the reason why that's going to be infinitely more interesting than Fortnite, at least in my opinion, is because in Fortnite, even though you theoretically can have all these different weapons and such, it boils down to the same thing over and over again. And honestly, that's an issue with other games like Minecraft as well, whereas with Overwatch, you're choosing a different character a lot of the times. If you become experienced enough, I know for a fact that if I've played Soldier 6 times and I'm starting to get all gold medals, I'm going to switch to a different character because it's boring. And that is another part of it, is not just, oh, you have to be able to customize your character or whatever. You have to be able to change things as you go on throughout the game. It's part of the reason why open world games tend to have feats or perks or whatever, and D&D has something very similar where the more you level up, the more you can class your character into what you want. It's so that you can change things and keep it so that the player is always having some agency. It's also part of the reason why multiple endings are certainly important in story-driven games, is because if it's always going to be the same ending, why play through in a different way at all? It's part of the reason why Bioshock Infinite was my least favorite game, whereas Bioshock 1 is one of my favorites of all time, is because Infinite had no different endings, whereas Bioshock 1, with no major choices to the player, has more than 6 separate endings dependent on minor choices the character makes.
Now, the last of my criteria for what makes a great game is stakes. And I'll give you an excellent example of what makes stakes work in a game, and that is the game of stud poker. For those of you who are not card players, stud poker is one where you get dealt a hand, and that's it. You're not giving any cards back. You're not getting additional cards. You just have the hand that you're dealt. Now, there's variations in rules and things like that. There's poker is its own whole conversation that I'm not going to get into. Point is, though, there is a version of poker where you get dealt your cards, and what you have is what you have. So if I'm sitting here with a hand of absolute garbage, there's nothing. Now, I've already got my ante on the table. So if I give up, I'm losing my ante. If I can bluff and convince my opponent that I actually do have a good hand, then at that point I have the chance of winning. But people, depending on the rules you go in and stuff, people will keep raising to see who's bluffing, to try to get, is he going to keep bluffing or is he going to play it out? And finally, you get to a point where it's what's called call, where everybody shows their cards. So if I've got a hand with nothing good in it, what I'm going for is to keep raising the bet until the other person just gives up. So that game is entirely stakes driven. It's entirely driven by, I'm trying to win something, and well, part of what makes it interesting too is that it's not all about your ability to lie, because your opponent could have a straight royal flush. Your opponent could have, the ultimate hand that you can't beat.
Yes, and at the risk of spoiling an 8-year-old game, so no apologies here about this, but spoiler warning, for the Nier Automata game, one of the most famous games out of Japan in Western culture right now, the ending of the game forces you to delete your save files or not. And what I mean by or not is that in the final boss fight, what ends up happening is you fight and you die, and you fight and you die in a space battle over and over again. And I think 5 rounds in, other ships start to show up to help you, and you continue to fight and you continue to die until it's a few hundred different ships show up, and all of them have encouraging little messages. And then you get the game over screen, and it's revealed that every one of those ships is another player who's deleted their save file information so they can send aid to another player. It's impossible to win without aid from other players. And then you are given the choice to delete your save file or to keep it. And there's no replayability otherwise in Nier Automata. You can keep your save file, but you can't go back to earlier levels. You can't replay any part of the game from there. So it brings up this question of, do you want to sacrifice all your hard work just to help somebody else? And that's what makes that one of the best games. I mean, the storyline, the philosophy, they're all very good, but it's that final choice for me which really gets me in the soul, as it were, is that final choice, because you are sacrificing not theoretical stakes or anything. You're not sacrificing the world, as it were, in game-ending Star Wars level stakes or anything. You're sacrificing hard work. You're sacrificing your time, your energy, to some extent your life, because that is 8 hours you're never going to get back if you delete it.
Now, in the D&D campaign that I'm running right now, I have 2 of my players are playing the characters they started with. Each of them gave me about a page backstory, for which I would nominate them for sainthood if that was a thing in my religion, and if they were dead, and they're not, and I don't want them to be like ever, because they're great people. The point is, they each gave me about a page of backstory, which I promptly incorporated into the campaign, so that they have stakes in the game. When you play something like D&D, where you do have a character that you've built, if the character that you've built has no effect on the outcome of the story, you lose your engagement because you're no longer affecting the story. It's also when games railroad you, be it D&D, video games, whatever, when you feel like you're being forced to a choice. There again, Age of Empires, traditionally you can win by defeating your opponent militarily, you can win by collecting all of the holy relics and holding them for a period of time, or you can win by building what's called wonder and keeping it standing for a period of time. So you've got options. And your opponent's going to be trying to stop you no matter what it is you're doing. You've got, that's where the difficulty comes in. But it creates this option for your style of play. If you don't have that, if it's something like, for example, those early Nintendo games, like they all got stale after a little while because there was just only one way to play through. Super Mario Brothers, it's the same game every time, no matter how many times you played it. And there are a few things that can really mess up a game, and before we wrap it up, I'd like to just do a quick list of those. The first and probably most obvious is glitching, and I'm going to take us all the way back to the oldest glitch that I know of in any game, and that is in the game of chess. It is possible to get to a position where one player cannot move without putting their king in check, or maybe just can't move at all if the pieces line up. Now, if you put your opponent in that position where their king can't move, they can't make any move without putting their king in check, chances are you were definitively winning. So if you reach a stalemate, that is a really frustrating moment because you should have won that game. The game should be over. I've had situations where I had basically a board full of pieces and my opponent was just down to his king, and I accidentally stalemated. And it's the most aggravating thing ever.
Yes, and my final thought on the matter is that progression is the next most important thing. You always have to have a sign that what the player is doing matters, even if it's not customized, even if it's not their choice. There has to be some reward for what they are doing, even if it's just the Dark Soulsian, oh, you killed the boss. that is still a reward for what the player is doing. There are genuinely games where you can kill all of the bosses in the game and not have gotten a single item from the boss drops. And there's a reason why you don't hear about those games or watch them anymore, because they all died out years ago. There's a reason why every game on the market right now has a leveling system, even games which don't make sense to have leveling systems. They do, because it's necessary for the player to feel, I got stronger for this, I got something out of this, even if it is just the most minor of battles. If I'm killing a level 1 slime or something, I want those 5 points of experience.
That was actually a problem with a lot of the earlier video games, Street Fighter and Mario Brothers and all of those, was that as you leveled up, you didn't get any stronger. You would always start There were ways to make your player stronger sometimes, long story. Point is, none of them were contingent on what bosses you defeated or anything like that. So level 10, you were basically playing the same character as level 1. And I would also say consequences can be very important, especially in story-based games. Mara was running a game one time where the party found out a secret, and it was something where it was like anybody who knew the secret was going to get executed. So I had the brilliant idea to go and announce it to the town square in this D&D game. And so the town guard came out and just started massacring the population who had heard. It's like, oh, okay, they really, wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, that was my first forte into Grimdark, but yeah, it works.
It was both of those things. So, yeah, if you're, whatever kind of game you're running, whatever kind of game you're designing, we need to, one, make sure that it's not glitching out frequently, because that does kill gameplay.
Cyberpunk.
And actually, that can even happen in D&D. For me, with D&D, it's the one where it's not so much either rules don't clearly cover it, or people are constantly having to stop and check things. And my rule as a DM is make a call, move on. And with video games, of course, you can't do that. The video game has to do something and keep going. And if you're writing code, for the love of God, write in some kind of a fail-safe where if you get yourself into a continuous loop or something like that, an infinite loop, the game will just skip that part and go on. Because, I'm not a coding expert, but I have done coding. Like, you can do it, man. I believe in you, especially when you have $1 million budgets behind you.
Oh, yes, that was actually another complaint about the BioShock game, which is known as a beautiful failure among the BioShock community, is that BioShock Infinite has a scene where you're going along the grappling line thing, and the objective marker shows you're supposed to keep going forward, and then there's a turn, and the objective will just take you in circles forever. I was on that section for 3.5 hours before I needed to figure out where to go, just because there was a minor graphical glitch in one of the most expensive games of the decade on where to show me where to go next. Avoid that, please.
Yes. And same thing if you're designing a board game, play through and realize, like, okay, this is where things can go wrong, this is where the rules might not be clear, and make it clear, or make some kind of fail-safe for when you have to just reset the game. So I think that's probably about enough for this one. We hope you found this interesting and enjoyable. Next up, we're going to be doing how to make Black Widow in D&D. We hope to see you on that one. Thank you for watching.